and it's exciting to see the international names and just the fabulous number of participants that we have this evening. So thank all of you for joining. Bruce, we've got their attention for an hour, so where do we go next?
Well, we're going to take an overview of the integral approach by introducing the four-quadrant model. The integral theory is a conceptual framework promoted by Ken Wilber, which tries to integrate a wide variety and diversity of theories and thinkers into one framework. And the framework can be very helpful to coaches in working with clients. So we're going to introduce the integral model. We're going to respond to questions and create a conversation on how it can be applied to your coaching practice and, very frankly, the way you personally think about the world. And finally, I'm going to point you to resources for further study, and we're going to tell some coaching stories along the way. Well, before we start on that, let me do a couple of things. First, I'd like everyone on the call to bring to mind and write down a particular coaching situation you've had with a client or a particular issue or dilemma that you're currently facing. And or if it was a coaching situation, how did you work with your client? And if it was a personal issue, what action are you taking? And I'm going to pause. I'm really serious about this. I think you're going to get the most out of this if you have a very specific coaching situation or personal challenge that you're facing in mind. So I'm going to pause for about 5 seconds, and I'm going to time it and ask you to really make a mental and possibly a physical note around what that coaching situation would be. Okay, so now before we get into the integral model, I'd like to introduce a coaching process that may be helpful in setting the context for our conversation. This is the next slide. So, what do coaches do? We facilitate change internally by fostering insight, and we facilitate change externally as clients take action. And this is just a representative example of the kind of processes that coaches use. And I'm not going to read all of these. I want to highlight a couple of them. The first step being awareness. The coach has, as part of their agenda, the need and to help the client become more aware of themselves and their environment at some level. And for change to take place, because beliefs and assessments drive our behavior, there needs to be some level of shift in beliefs and assessments in order for us to really make the kind of behavioral changes that is necessary for us to be more successful, which is all a part of what coaching is about. This is just to provide you with a little bit of context for what we're going to be discussing. Now I'm going to move into the model itself, and it provides an integrative way of thinking about leadership. It's a tool that helps to see the big picture or the integral picture. So there are two dichotomies. Let me back up a minute. There's one thing that I missed here, and that is the whole idea that we are presenting a model. And a model is a map. It's not a territory. What I mean by that is that, if we're going down the road, we can look at a map, but the map is not the road. It's just a way of viewing things. It's a useful fiction, in a sense, that allows us to navigate and to look at different perspectives. There are two dichotomies that emerge from this model. The individual versus the collective, and the subjective versus the objective. With this, we can see all perspectives of a particular situation. So the upper left quadrant of the map refers to the subjective part of you. It's the part that cannot be seen by a medical scan. This quadrant includes your values, your beliefs, emotions, personality dynamics. The upper right quadrant is the objective part of you as an individual. It includes your physical body and what others can objectively see about you. It includes your behavior and your physical presence. The lower left quadrant, the interior collective, relates to the collective world. It includes those subjective dynamics that we share with others, such as cultural values and beliefs to which our group ascribes. These groups maybe include our country, our ethnicity, our family, the organizations which we're affiliated with. And then the lower right quadrant is your exterior objective, which is everything external to us. So it includes arenas of the physical world, such as sciences, mathematics, economics, and business, the business of doing business, and including business systems. And, you know, it's interesting that at any particular moment, all of these quadrants are at play and interrelating to each other. Our behavior influences our values and personality influence our behavior. Our behavior influences the culture. The culture impacts how the group behaves and thus affects the performance of the organization. So everything we do impacts all quadrants, whether you're aware of it or not. We're therefore using this model as an integrative way of thinking about business and working with clients. Now, if you think about a business meeting, look at the lower right quadrant. So we have this business meeting going on, and we're talking about all kinds of business content. We're talking about taking action. We're talking about strategies. We're talking about approaches. We're reviewing data. We're doing all of these things. And under the surface, we have the other two quadrants on the left side going on. Your interior, individual, and collective, all going on. And in a typical business meeting, that's never discussed. The only time it's discussed generally is when a coach comes into the mix or a consultant. Most of the time, you know, it's all about business, and underneath the sea, in the same way that you can look at the surface of a body of water, and, you know, you see the boats on the surface, but there's all kinds of stuff going underneath. That's exactly what's going on in a meeting. So let's take a look at the model in terms of using the language. And I call this the integral model of leadership mastery math. Now, while surprisingly simple, the model gives a framework that allows one to understand the whole system while acknowledging which area or quadrant we may be viewing the system from. And all quadrants are arising at once. Now, for instance, right now, my internal subjective experience involves feelings about doing this webinar, assessments of how well I'm doing, my beliefs about coaching, and so forth. And at the same time, my body's functions, neurons are firing. And I'm immersed in an intersubjective culture of shared beliefs and values and even emotions with you who are on the call. And there's the objective reality on the lower right, the technology, the systems that bring us together. These systems are interconnected through global markets, national laws, ecologies, economics, and so forth. So the basic premise of the model is that what happens in one quadrant is reflected in all. And it provides a platform for coaching which links the inner values, intentions, and perceptions of an individual with their outer behaviors. So let's look at this a little more. If you look at the upper left, we have beliefs. So where do the beliefs come from? Do they come from the lower right quadrant or the lower left? Well, they probably come from both at some level, but I'm suggesting that the lower left quadrant is the predominant influence. So when and where we were born, into what group, has a huge influence on our beliefs. And to the extent that strongly held beliefs can override the lower right quadrant. So part of the dynamic is between the upper left and the lower right quadrant. And one of the examples I use here is looking at an example of four things that are in the news a lot, and that's part of our current dialogue. GMO, genetically modified foods, anti-vaxxing beliefs around the efficacy of vaccination and how it might cause other things other than just inoculating from a disease, global warming, and evolution. Now, all of those scientific research, facts, and logic does not change many people's views on that. So their beliefs in actuality override the lower right quadrant, the objective exterior. I heard an interview the other day with an astronomy professor I found interesting. He said that 15% of his students don't believe what he teaches, but will take the tests with the right answers. They actually will communicate that to him on a one-on-one basis. Their religious beliefs say that the world was created 6,000 years ago. And of course, he's talking about literally billions of years when he's talking about astrology. So what does this have to do with coaching? Very often, what blocks the client from succeeding is a particular belief about the world that he or she takes as a fact or unchangeable. And the integral approach to coaching allows us to create understanding and distinctions with the client, allows the client to clearly look at their perceptions of the world as separate and observable facts. That there's more than one story than only their story. I'm going to repeat that. There's more than one story than only their story. So making the distinctions between facts and assessments, i.e. opinions, can be huge, particularly in understanding that we have multiple realities governed by our beliefs and assessments about ourselves and others. So as a coach, just having this in mind, here we're talking about, again, having this as a model for your learning and also having it as a model for inquiry. You don't lead with this. It's in the background. It's an understanding. And with a sufficient amount of study with this, it will give you a much deeper sort of level of awareness yourself such that you can impart through questioning and so forth and create that awareness among with your clients. So let's take another example. Let's take the upper left and the upper right quadrants. We talked here about moods and emotions, which is the interior subjective. Moods affect behavior, don't they? But there's also a limbic resonance that makes moods contagious. So at some level, there's an impact among a group of people who are experiencing the same mood. And that comes through physiology, but in actuality, it sort of permeates and is part of the intersubjective dynamics of a group. Look at the difference between the mood, if you will, at a funeral and the mood at a basketball game. Obviously very, very different, and there's a contagious dynamic to it. And so when you look at the leader, for instance, a leader's mood impacts the office. The mood in the house can shift when somebody comes home from work. So just simply having a conversation about mood might be helpful with a client. And you can see that the dynamic of the model plays out all of the time, and that understanding it can inform your coaching. So let me give you just a simple example. I was having a conversation the other day with a client about an offsite. The client is not seen as very inspiring. But as he was going through all of the the agenda and what he was attempting to do and who was to be involved and so forth and so on. It was all in the lower right quadrant. It was all about the business meeting. At some point I just asked him, I said, what mood do you want to create? He kind of, was brought up a little bit, thought about it, and he indicated what it was. What would be the benefit of having that mood in the group as you were doing your offsite? And who would you have to be to have that mood in the group? And that conversation was just a very, very insightful, helpful conversation with him in terms of being able to have an understanding of how his mood impacts the group. And this might be amusing to you. We talked about, what some ideas might work. And I said, how about music? And it was like, oh, wow, what a concept. How many people play music before a business meeting? Music shifts moods incredibly. And so just kind of brainstorming there. So it gives a framework for coaches for inquiry with clients and for helping clients change so that they can be more fulfilled in their work and more successful in their organizations. And to help clients see how their actions are driven by their personality, beliefs, assessments, and if there's going to be a change that needs to be examined. Anytime, I think, with an organization or with an individual, the change is initiated, or you want to make changes, you have to look at all of these dynamics. One of the things that's happening now in companies and the consultants are certainly on this bandwagon and driving it. We got into strategic planning and making changes and integrating companies on acquisitions by doing strategic planning processes and so forth. And many times acquisitions and mergers fail at some level from a financial standpoint. And one of the things that they've recognized is that culture makes a whole huge difference in whether or not companies can merge effectively or whether companies can be more successful in their business. And so there's a whole line of business now helping companies change their culture in order to have an impact on their business success. And I'm going to have some resources for you that later on in the call.
So you suggested, Bruce, that we think of a client in a circumstance as you taught. So looking at the leadership mastery map, when a client is in a tough circumstance and you're working with them and the pathway is not clear, what is the first thing you do with this map? I mean, where do you start? I would think it would be the individual interior subjective.
Yes.
To start with where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that there's kind of a logical flow with most of your clients? Is there something where you kind of find that an interior subjective is one place that kind of kicks off and then you kind of flow into another place, or is it just different for every client?
Well, I think it's pretty much of an intuitive process. It's not something that you do in a linear basis.
Right.
What you're listening for, or if a client sucks, you're listening for the beliefs they might have that might be inhibiting them taking action. Right. There might be self-assessments where they don't think they're good enough to do it, or they think they have assessments of other individuals who are blocking them. So there might very well be some assessments or beliefs there, or you might ask about something more objective, like, what are the obstacles that you're facing, which would be the lower right quadrant. So it really is very much a function of what the individual coaching situation is. There's no linear dynamic to this.
Right. I was talking more like a trend. If you found, But I got it. That's helpful.
Okay, Victoria, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, okay. So I have a question, and my question just is, have you ever used the model, shared the model with your client? And if so, how did that work out?
Thanks, Judith.
You're welcome.
Well, you don't lead with this. You don't use it pedagogically, and what I mean by that is you go to the client and say, "Oh boy, let me show you this great new thing I've learned," or use it as a teaching tool. At least I don't do that. I primarily use it in the background, and when there's situations that arise where it's useful for the client to have this kind of perspective, and there's an opportunity for you to introduce it where it could truly be valuable for them in the moment, then that's when you would present it. It's not something that you would necessarily lead. And I have definitely used this. I have a little example later on where I've used this with a client, and to get them to really understand what their impact is, what their personal leadership impact is on the organization.
So I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
So when clients present, usually clients have a presenting issue. Okay, is it from the beginning? Are you already sorting with the map or the integral model where they are and how the other quadrants are going to impact them?
Yes. Yeah, you are, and you're also at some level within looking at, and this is not part of the discussion, but as part of the integral theory, you're also looking at their level of development. So there are a number of different sort of windows that you're looking through as you're working with them. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess the last thing I'll just say is I definitely see how, and of course I have used it myself, but I see how it is just so striking for me in helping ask questions that really help them surface achieve whatever they're wanting to achieve.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the key. It really is a way for you to structure the inquiry. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
As I'm looking at the left-hand side, one of the things that's come up recently has been, there's the Gardner studies of employees that show people are so disconnected from their work and so antagonistic to their organizations. But there's recently a conference board study where, like 70-80% of the leaders say they're doing just fine and their people should love them. And I'm almost thinking that with the bigger disparities of incomes and the disconnects that we're seeing, that we almost have two sets down in the collective of cultural values and beliefs. One that's coming at the top among the executives, and a second one that almost inhabits a totally different universe down in the rank and file. And it seems to be so often that those two just don't come together. And it's not so much because in the lower right, the business its systems are keeping it apart. It's truly that the life experiences that people in the middle have nothing to do with the sort of life experiences that wealthy executives have.
Yeah, that's true. And there are multiple cultures in any kind of organization or any kind of larger culture, and so the dynamics between the cultures can be very very problematic, particularly in a business situation. The one thing I'll say as well is that the leadership, while there might be different cultures, at the lower levels, the leadership really does set the tone, and the behavior of the leader has a huge influence on what the culture is. And at least that's been my experience in working with companies. That being said, there are times when a new leader will come into a company and the culture is so strong in the midst of them making changes that the culture actually spits them out. And they end up leaving or being fired because the culture is just is so resistant to change that they're not going to allow it, so to speak. But the leadership and the executive group does have, in many, as you're saying, a different set of values, perhaps a different set of beliefs. They're rewarded differently, and so there is that disconnect. There's no question about it.
I'll give you a really practical example. I'm working on some travel software, and I get this absolute ranting and raving from the folks that the approved hotels are wrong, and I'm going, well, what's wrong with these hotels? Well, they're all like 3,300 euros and above a night, 4-star, 5-star hotels that the executives had requested, but none of the desk level folks that actually travel have that kind of stuff in their budget, so they have to find $100 a night hotels, and they're not approved. And it's like, there you go again with that. They live in different universes, right?
They do. Yeah. You're right.
I'm calling from Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Hello. It's been nice to meet you here. This is my first time to be in coaching program or something like that. And I want to ask you can you give us more examples about how using this map with your clients. In the beginning of this course, I couldn't hear. There's a problem with the sound, or I don't know about the dial pad. So half of that I didn't hear it. But if you at least give us some examples how you use this map with your clients.
And I'm going to use this as an example to kind of explain what the process might look like. So we have a company that's not doing well, $500 million company. It's got 5 division managers and a president, and they're not as successful as they would like to be. The president, we did a 360 feedback, we did assessments and so forth, and it was discovered that he was very highly perfectionistic. His success had been driven by capturing as much data as possible. He was, in effect, was pointing himself as the quality control manager for the organization, and so his personality drove a certain kind of behavior around execution and the way that he dealt and led the organization. And basically what it was requiring that the division presidents and everybody under them capture information like in spades, a weekly or biweekly or monthly presentations, 100-page PowerPoint presentation, slide deck, where they're capturing copious amounts of information and spending hours and hours and hours on their staff to provide all of that data, because he felt that was the way for him to make sure that the organization was effectively working. And when they were in the meetings, he was second-guessing them. He was substituting his judgment for theirs. In a sense, he was at a level of development where he was leading with the answer. He was the expert. And so that behavior had an impact on the culture, and it had an impact on the collective feelings of the people involved, and it created a culture that was very, very compliant and very oriented toward data, if you will, because that was the driver. And as a consequence, of course, that had an impact on the business. One of the salespeople said, "My goodness, I spend so much time writing reports and generating PowerPoint presentations. I don't have time to spend with customers." And another dynamic associated with it was that there was turnover in some of the ranks in the middle management and higher ranks. The people who were left were, compliant and had a thing for data, I guess, whereas the innovative and entrepreneurial people were actually leaving the company because of those cultural dynamics. So I've got one more arrow here. I think obviously the behavior and actions have an impact on the business. So giving the executive feedback on this and explaining this to them in such a way that they get an appreciation for what their behavior and what their success strategies are, what those strategies are, and how it's impacting the organization was paramount here. Executives, managers have. When we emerge into our 20s and early 30s, our personality drives our behavior. Our behavior then is reinforced by successes, and we develop a success strategy. When situations change, that strategy no longer operates potentially and is not as successful. And this was a clear example of this. So this was obviously a situation where there was, if you look at that earlier coaching model, we got an understanding of what the gap is. And so there has to be a recognition and a willingness to close that gap. What does he need to do differently to respond to the feedback that he's getting? And is he willing to make a declaration to make a change? And, many times it's very, very difficult for people to change. But it certainly requires that declaration in order for them to really get clear about what the motivations, what the reasons are that they're changing, and to be motivated to do it. So that's an example of how this would work. And what I talked about right there, the example I used, could be a story that does have of someone who doesn't have any knowledge about this model whatsoever, right? We've all coaches been there, but this model does provide a mental framework for us to use in situations like this. So I appreciate you calling from halfway around the world. I hope that was helpful in kind of giving you a sense of what this is about.
Changes ourselves, or changes the leadership, will change the world.
Yes. Yeah, it's the key, for sure.
How would you use the model to focus on the actions the client would take?
Well, the actions have to be in service to what? What are they trying to accomplish? And let me use another slide to answer that question, because I think that's really good. Okay, so we have a situation where, we have, we're looking at the exterior objective. Okay, what kind of actions can you take in order to achieve what you want? And you can have a great coaching conversation on the right side of the model. In terms of what's getting in your way, what is your strategy, how are you going to go about executing this, talk about, marketing or systems, huge conversations, and coaches can have a significant amount of value in just focusing on that right side of the quadrant. There's no question about it. What I'm suggesting is that the insight that one can gain by looking at the entire picture is one that will just add a richness to the conversation, and such that the change can actually be made. Sometimes people will get stuck and fine, you're asking them to take actions and they're not doing it. Well, it might very well be necessary to look behind that inability to act, in terms of what are the beliefs or what are the personality dynamics that might very well inhibit them from taking the kind of action that they need to take. I hope I hope that's helpful. I'm not sure I responded, Dave, specifically, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it as far as the response to that.
Do you correlate this to EQ? So I'm taking that
Yes,
emotional
okay.
intelligence in the
the
quadrant.
emotional intelligence. Yes, you can overlay EQ on here to some extent. For those who are not familiar with emotional intelligence, you're looking at self-awareness, social awareness, and then self-management as well as relationship management. Those are the 4 key competencies. And when you look at that particular model, certainly the self-awareness comes from the interior subjective and being able to monitor your emotions. I had a client. I do have to. We just had that one more question. Let me tell you a quick story. I had a client who was executive with a financial executive, who was very successful and invisible. So he's technically very good, but he had no presence whatsoever, none. It was just amazing. You could barely hear the guy. Spoke with an accent. He was from South Asia, and he just did not show up. He would just sort of spend his time in his office, and when he was in meetings, he was very quiet. When he spoke up, he couldn't be heard. And I worked with him for 6 months, and we used all of this stuff. He monitored his emotions. We went through the self-assessment in terms of what his beliefs were. When you shake his hand, it's like a limp wrist, and he looked down. It was not looking in the eye when you're shaking hands. Well, that's a cultural thing, right? That was cultural for him. We had a huge conversation about just simply how to properly shake hands. We did role play. I was the President of the United States. He'd come across and shake my hand, look me in my eye, and say, good evening, Mr. President. And so there's a number of somatic things that we did. We're talking about the upper right quadrant, where we went to a martial arts studio. We actually took him through some somatic exercises in order to create a greater sort of embodiment of who he was. We increased the volume of his voice when he spoke, and we actually did some accent reduction stuff. So we practiced him going into a meeting, sitting down, taking charge of the meeting, taking up the space, right? And in the midst of that, all of that work, that he was very, very diligent client. We talked about emotional intelligence, and he monitored his emotions. He had a little thing on his phone, and 4 or 5 times a day, he would actually write down what emotion he had, so that he become much more self-aware of what his internal state was, and as a consequence, he was able to show up very, very powerfully, and ultimately was promoted. So quite a success story. It's always great to have a client who's really willing to do the work. So yeah. Let me move on to these next 4 slides really quickly.
Okay.
What I'd like to do is just to give you this. You're going to get a PowerPoint on this, but these are general resources that you can have available to learn more about this. So we have Wilbur's book. We have a book by I'm a huge fan of this guy, Bill Joyner. Frederick Leclue, I don't know whether you read an article about Zappos, who's totally changing their whole culture, and they're eliminating all the managers. 14% of the company, the people in the company left. They're redesigning the whole organization. It's all around the Reinventing Organizations book, and his primary foundational approach is integral. And then we have my book. These are various assessments for the upper left quadrant. The ones on the left, the Berkman, the Enneagram is something that I've used, as well as the emotional intelligence. These others, I've used the Myers-Briggs for years. These others are available to you. Coaching to the Human Soul is an ontological work, and it talks about ontological coaching. It's just phenomenal. One of the best coaching books I've ever seen. Spiritual intelligence. The Righteous Mind is really interesting. That's not coaching, but it talks about moral development and why there's such a debate around politics and religion and science. It's fascinating. the lower left quadrant, we have culture, change the culture. One of the coaches in town is doing a huge amount of work using the change culture model from that book. Spiral dynamics is a huge thing in terms of developing insight into culture. Upper right, this is all around the body and around execution. We have an author on the phone here with us who's written The Buck Stops Here around accountability and execution. Alan Dabrowski, excellent book. Some of these you might be familiar with, but all of these I will attest to their value. And then the lower right quadrant, of course, every other book in the world that has to do with, science, business, and so forth. The Beyond Change Management book is one that I think is very, very helpful in the lower right quadrant in execution. Yes.
Hello, you're on the line.
Hello, this is Jan. Yes, wonderful webinar. Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I have a question regarding your own book. And you were just showing some slides that you have a book which also includes an assessment. The assessment, is that something, if one wanted to use that with clients, is there a training that you offer for that?
No. You can use it with clients. I'd encourage you to take it, go on the Leadership Mastery Map website and take the assessment. I don't want to diminish the assessment because I worked my butt off on it, but it's really a categorization of a number of articles. You prioritize things in terms of what's important to you, but it's not sufficiently sophisticated to be something that would be training and so forth. By going through it and looking at the material on the website, you'll get quite a bit from it.
Lovely. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks.
And I thank you all for taking the time to be with us.